Hey guys, I'm Fortin, and in this video I will explain the difference between overdrives and boosters in a high gain setting. Oftentimes when I'm browsing the forums, I'll find a lot of people asking which pedals are better. Is it the grind, is it the 33, the blade, or is it the hex drive? I largely see this when referring to the neural DSP plugins here, or sometimes referring to the actual hardware. In short, these pedals do different things. The hex drive is an overdrive, while pedals like the grind, 33, and blade are boosters. Before we describe the purpose of a booster or an overdrive, let me briefly explain clipping. Any given amplifier only has so much headroom in it before it exceeds its electrical capacity and then starts to clip or distort the signal. Like what I just did right here. I boosted the gain internally so it would clip the signal. It's not great, but I did it. That's an example. Clipping is when the signal, in this case your guitar signal, exceeds its device peak, resulting in the signal's transients getting cut off or squaring off. Or to put it simply, it is when the signal of your guitar is so strong it distorts within the given device. In this case your amp, sometimes it might be your interface or internally in software to create that distortion. Alright, let's talk about boosters. The basic purpose of a boost is to push more signal into your preamp so then your guitar can more directly saturate into your amp. This method can achieve a more organic feeling distortion on a tube amp because the saturation or clipping occurs within the amp itself. The 33, the blade, and the grind are boosters with an imprinted EQ curve, allowing a guitarist or producer to add additional gain into an amp with an EQ'd signal before it hits the preamp. Alright, so just note the blade is also a booster that modifies one's EQ curve. The deep knob modifies the low end of the EQ curve, and the cut knob operates the high end of the EQ curve. Alright, so let me show you a few examples of my guitar going into an amp with and without a booster. Alright, so up next is overdrives. Alright, so overdrives and distortions, I'm just going to sneak distortions in here because it's worth mentioning, clip a signal before it hits your amp. So by the time your guitar signal hits your amp, it is already somewhat distorted or heavily distorted, depending on how you dialed it in. Likened to boosters, the overdrive will push the amp past its internal clipping threshold, but your amp will also take care of that additional distortion that is not already clipped by the pedals. It can be noted that clipping is also a form of compression, making your guitar signal less dynamic in this process. Overdrives can push an amp past its natural distortion or kick it into a very saturated, overdriven state. Alright, so let me show you a few examples of my guitar going through an amp with and without the hex drive in multiple settings so I can show you how it sounds overdriven and heavily clipped. To simply put it between the two, a booster versus an overdrive will change where the clipping point or offset where the clipping occurs in your signal chain. Overdrives and distortion will clip the signal before it hits the amp, and boosters will push the signal to clip harder within the amp. So the best way to describe it, it's like putting ketchup on your hamburger or having it to the side, then dropping it in the burger while you take each bite. They will taste slightly different between the two, but the end result is similar. Deciding between a drive and a booster, in my personal opinion, ultimately depends on my amplifier and how much I want the amplifier to handle the clipping. For example, if I feel like the natural distortion of my amplifier is not giving me a particular bite or sound no matter how much gain I throw at it within the amp, I might decide that an overdrive is the call, because I can guarantee that my signal is clipped before it hits the amplifier. This in turn makes my amplifier work less, giving me a more compressed signal on the way into my amp and a more consistent sound across the board for multiple amps. Although this does not mean my distortion will sound the same on every amp when using the hex drive, it just means my expectation for how an amp behaves can be dialed in by the hex drive rather than by the amp head itself. So in this section of the video, I will show you a few audio examples between the hex drive and the Fortin boosters. Alright, so now I will show you the previous audio examples I had earlier of the hex drive and the boosters, but show them back to back so you can A/B them between the boosters, the overdrive, and the vanilla amp signal. Alright, so let's recap. Clipping is when a signal inputting into a device is so strong it squares off or distorts. Boosters increase the amount of signal pushed into an amp. Overdrives and distortions clip the signal before it hits the amp and can also boost the signal. And to simplify it, a booster versus an overdrive will change where the clipping occurs or offset where the clipping occurs. Overdrives and distortions will clip the signal before it hits the amp, and boosters will push the signal to clip within the amp. And in my personal opinion, a booster will lean into an amp's distortion or clipping characteristics, where a distortion will impose a bit of its own. So all in all, I hope this video gave you guys a better understanding of the difference between a booster and an overdrive, and when to use them. And if it did, please hit that thumbs up button, sub to the channel if you haven't already, ring that bell for notifications, and let us know in the comments below if you're team overdrive, team booster, or both, and why. Again, I'm Mel from Fortin, and I'll see you on the next one.